Tweets aren't policy, but they still get you in trouble. App Photoge. David R.K. Donald Trump's commitment to avoid antagonizing Russian officials on Twitter, a courtesy he reserves for no one else, was conspicuous months ago. Despite his reported fondness for those who return fire and engage the critics in public fora, Trump seems determined to turn the other cheek when it comes to Russia. This week, Moscow's efforts to provoke and agitate the president finally succeeded. And yet, rather than take his aggravation out on the Kremlin, he vomited his frustrations out all over Congress. The remarks by the Russian Prime Minister following Trump's decision to sign into law new sanctions on Moscow, backed by veto-proof majorities in Congress, represents the most melodramatic attempt to force the president to lose his cool yet. The U.S. establishment fully outwitted Trump, wrote Vladimir Putin's Prime Minister, Dmitry Medvedev. The Trump administration has shown its total weakness by handing over executive power to Congress in the most humiliating way. This isn't the first occasion in which operatives linked to the Kremlin used language seemingly intentionally calibrated to generate an emotional response from the American president, but it was the most successful. But rather than defend his honor against Russian slights, Trump essentially confirmed the accuracy of Medvedev's taunt. Our relationship with Russia is at an all-time very dangerous low, the president wrote. You can thank Congress, the same people that can't even give us care. Compounding the cognitive dissonance in Trump's broadside against Congress was the fact that Vice President Mike Pence read this tweet amid his tour of some of the most threatened former Soviet republics. Russia seeks to redraw international borders by force, undermine democracies of sovereign nations and divide the free nations of Europe, Pence said after a meeting with the leaders of the 3 Baltic states. A strong and united NATO is more necessary today than at any point since the collapse of communism a quarter-century ago, and no threat looms larger in the Baltic states than the specter of aggression from your unpredictable neighbor to the east. Pence declined to address the threat to the peace in Europe posed by Congress. Trump deserves some credit for finally acknowledging that Russo-American relations have deteriorated to a dangerous point, but only very little. The Russian reset Trump hoped to engineer the third consecutive attempt at rapprochement with Moscow was over before it truly began. The president has made every effort to avoid the fact that Moscow's geopolitical interests conflict with those of the United States. Trump insulted the nation he leads in February when he made a bizarre attempt to strike a moral equivalence between the government of the United States and the murderous cabal in the Kremlin, but those conciliatory words were never followed on with action. By the time Moscow briefly closed the deconfliction hotline in Syria to protest Trump's April airstrikes on Russia's vassal in Damascus, the third Russian reset was already dead. Washington's move deals a significant blow to the Russia-US relations, which are already in a deplorable shape, said Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov. Russia appeared to hold out some hope that Trump may yet be useful, but he was not. Institutional pressures inside the United States and the structure of its alliances abroad prevented Donald Trump from offering Russia any major concessions, with the glaring exception of giving up on anti-Assad rebels in Syria, thrusting them into the arms of more radical militias. The sanctions relief Moscow anticipated never materialized. Its diplomatic facilities, shuttered by Barack Obama following Russia's intervention in the 2016 election, remain closed. American armed forces continue to stream back into Europe, reinforcing NATO's increasingly tense frontier. The Republican Congress decision to strip the president of the authority to administer Russian sanctions has less to do with the fear of Trump's policies than it does an acknowledgement of the president's inexplicable refusal to call Russia the threat that it is when he's not reading from a teleprompter. The Trump administration is now compelled by law to demonstrate that Russian behavior has changed before lifting sanctions imposed on Moscow after its invasion of Ukraine, but the White House has always said it would not lift those sanctions absent total Russian withdrawal. The administration has angered Moscow by greenlighting the sale of liquid natural gas to Russian clients in Eastern and Central Europe, and they have committed to providing Poland with anti-ballistic missile technology over the Kremlin's objections. It's Trump's actions as much as Congress that are aggravating Moscow. It's Trump's unfailing rhetorical support for Moscow that rendered him untrustworthy. Surely, Robert Mueller's probe into potential misdeeds involving the Trump campaign, the Trump Organization, and Russia have left the president feeling cornered. Moreover, no president would allow Congress to steal power away from the White House without protest. But, taken as a whole, the Trump administration's Russia policy isn't as controversial as are the president's reckless tweets. Maybe lawmakers and the public wouldn't be so concerned about Trump's relationship with Russia if he just kept his mouth shut. Can Rex Tillerson fix its State Department? Among the many stories of internecine battles within the Trump administration is the supposed discord between the White House and the State Department. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson is reportedly frustrated with White House vetoes of his staff picks, the encroachment of Trump aides and family in the traditional business of diplomacy, and resents Trump's unprofessional attacks on colleagues. Critics both inside and outside the State Department have questioned his leadership style and judgment, and some foreign policy watchers have speculated that Tillerson may be the weakest Secretary of State ever. Others have written about growing State Department dysfunction, as well as Tillerson's brusqueness and incompetence. The State Department may be broken, but, even if Tillerson's tenure has highlighted its problems, the dysfunction in the State Department is deep-seated and extends well before Trump's antics and Tillerson's questionable management style. Secretary of State Colin Powell's Chief of Staff Lawrence Wilkerson, for example, was a conspiracy theorist who has peddled in anti-Semitic dog whistles and has since found himself on the academic board of the Ron Paul Institute. In hindsight, while Deputy Secretary of State Richard Armitage proved himself a serial leaker in efforts to win bureaucratic battles against the Pentagon, the sustenance for many of the more outlandish conspiracies appears to have come from Wilkerson. A whiff of corruption surrounds Secretary of State Hillary Clinton's State Department because of the Clinton Foundation and the diplomatic favors which foreign states apparently believed they could receive if they made a donation. But, beyond that, Clinton appeared to base her decisions about when and where to travel on personal vanity rather than strategic necessity. Secretary of State John Kerry took dubious travel to an extreme. His trip to Antarctica, a region that has no diplomats with whom to engage, was tourism on the public dime, plain and simple. To suggest he needed to spend millions of taxpayer dollars and bring an entourage with him to talk about climate change with scientists with whom he could simply have initiated a Skype connection suggests mismanagement in his head office and the complete breakdown of internal controls. Clinton and Kerry, like Tillerson, also surrounded himself with a small and largely impenetrable coterie of aides. Critics are right that Tillerson has not distinguished himself in his new post. Promised State Department reform is nowhere in sight, morale is low, and American diplomacy has been largely ineffective. But ineffective diplomacy is a broader problem and a reflection of a State Department which offers little direction or incentive for diplomats to be on the same page and to work toward a common goal. In the last half-century, the State Department has never conducted a lesson-learned exercise to determine how and why its most high-profile diplomacy with rogue regimes has gone awry. Its key leaders fail to recognize that continuing dialogue is not always the means to the end, and that compromise is not always a solution. Yes, critics are right, Tillerson's State Department is broken. But, if the State Department is to be fixed, it's important to acknowledge that a succession of secretaries from both parties presided over its decline. Immigration for Mar-a-Lago, not for the Apfote Mel Evans file. On Wednesday, the Trump administration made a big show of support for a radical immigration bill sponsored by Republican Sens. Tom Cotton and David Perdue. One part of the legislation makes a lot of sense. The other doesn't. The part that is sensible would transition America's immigration system from favoring family reunification to favoring a skills-based test for entry. That is the model that Canada uses, and it has worked very well in boosting that country's population and economy. As Jonathan Tepperman, the managing editor of Foreign Affairs and a Canadian expatriate, pointed out, while immigrants are a boost to America, they are an even bigger boost to Canada. About half of all Canadian immigrants arrive with a college degree, while the figure in the United States is just 27%, he wrote. Immigrant children in Canadian schools read at the same level as the native-born, while the gap is huge in the United States. Canadian immigrants are almost 20% more likely to own their own homes and 7% less likely to live in poverty than their American equivalents. If all that the Cotton Perdue bill did was to adopt the Canadian model for the U.S., it would be a cause for celebration. But along with this sensible revision of the 1965 Immigration and Naturalization Act, it also includes a plan to reduce overall immigration by half within a decade. It would stop 85% of family-based arrivals while keeping constant, at roughly 140,000 per year, the number of immigrants allowed in based on job skills. This makes no sense. As James Pathokoukis of the American Enterprise Institute argued, the U.S. economy would benefit from more, not less, immigration, as long as it's skills-based. Younger, harder-working immigrants are, in fact, essential to prevent a demographic implosion, similar to those now occurring in Europe, China, Japan, South Korea and other countries, where an ever-shrinking workforce cannot support an ever-growing number of baby boomer retirees. A survey of economists found that 89% strongly agree that the average U.S. citizen would be better off if a larger number of highly educated foreign workers were legally allowed to immigrate to the U.S. each year. As Pathokoukis noted, immigrant scientists and entrepreneurs play a disproportionate role in driving the technological advances that power productivity growth in the United States. He writes that roughly half of U.S.-based unicorns, technology startups worth at least $1 billion, were founded by immigrants, with India the top nation of origin. What about claims that more immigration hurts low-income Americans? That was the case advanced at the White House by Stephen Miller, a nativist who previously worked for then Senator Jeff Sessions and now for President Trump. Miller was one of the driving forces behind the ill-conceived ban on arrivals from 7 Muslim nations that caused chaos at the nation's airports in January. Now he is pushing for a massive 50% reduction in immigration. When pressed by Glenn Thrush of the New York Times to cite evidence in support of his contention that immigration hurts the working class, African Americans and Latinos in particular, Miller fell back on discredited studies claiming that newcomers exacerbate income inequality. In fact, as Philip Bump observed in The Washington Post, the effects of immigration on income inequality are modest. A recent study by the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine found that immigrants aren't taking American jobs, save for those held by teenagers who don't finish high school. By contrast, this comprehensive study found that high school immigrants spur innovation and boost the overall economy. There is, in short, plenty of justification for moving to a skills-based immigration model, while not completely closing the door to family reunification on grounds of humanity. There is, however, no justification for cutting legal immigration by 50%. The fact that the Trump White House is so eager to push this plan exposes the real agenda of anti-immigration activists. They claim to be opposing illegal immigration only, but it is clear they want to vastly reduce legal immigration, too. And while justifying these cutbacks on economic grounds, it's hard not to suspect that their agenda is actually cultural and ethnic. There are some in Stephen Miller's camp who are eager to reverse what they see as dangerous demographic trends. They should expand the xenophobic agenda more honestly rather than hiding behind specious economic claims. The hypocrisy is all the more astounding, given that President Trump is once again bringing in foreign guest workers to staff Mar-a-Lago, and Jared Kushner's family company is being investigated for selling visas to wealthy Chinese. The White House message seems to be that foreign workers are good for the Trump family's business, but not for the country as a whole. The incurious political reporter. When I was working in political public relations under the late, great Jim Vlasto, one of the first things he taught me was that, while it's not always the case, the way to bet is that political reporters are both ignorant and lazy. Yesterday, Jim Acosta of CNN showed exactly what Jim Vlasto meant. Outraged at the new immigration proposal Trump announced yesterday, Acosta took on the White House's Stephen Miller and got his head handed to him, largely because Acosta was long on liberal moral arrogance and very short on the facts. Acosta essentially made 2 points. One was that the proposed legislation that Miller was defending did not square with the poem by Emma Lazarus, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free." Miller pointed out that, great as the poem is, it is not part of the Constitution. Furthermore, the circumstances of 1883, when it was written, are perhaps no longer pertinent in the early 21st century, and we might need new legislation to deal with that reality. Acosta's other point was that the legislation would require immigrants to know English before they could get a green card. He apparently didn't know the current law requires the very same thing. He could have looked it up in a few seconds on Wikipedia, but, as Jim Vlasto said, political reporters tend to be lazy. Acosta then said that that requirement would mean that only immigrants from Britain and Australia could get in. Perhaps HES never heard of Canada, where practically all its 35 million citizens, including French Canadians, can speak English, while Mandarin Chinese has the most native speakers, with around 900 million. English is third with about 371 million. But Mandarin is spoken almost entirely in northern China. English is either the official or unofficial language in no fewer than 52 different countries around the world. The sun may have set on the British Empire, but the sun never sets on the English language. English is by far the dominant second language in the world. No fewer than 611 million speak it as a second tongue. In polyglot India, the parliament debates in English because it's every Indian's second language. Commercial aviation has only one language used throughout the world, and that language is English. The English language is the overwhelmingly dominant language of science. Most scientific journals now come out, at least at first, in English, even that of France's leading scientific institute, the Institut Pasteur. Major scientific conferences are always held in English. In Europe, English is, again by a very wide margin, the most studied foreign language. 73% of primary students in European schools are studying English. Fully 90% of European secondary students are studying English. The reason is that non-English-speaking countries realize that in the modern global economy, knowing English is just as important as math and reading and writing in the local tongue. This all means that most applicants for green cards, most of them highly skilled, whether they come from Europe, Asia, or elsewhere, will already be competent in English. Policymakers know that. Political reporters, apparently, don't. The long, hard slog. President Trump is right to be concerned about present trends in Afghanistan, where, despite nearly 16 years of war, the Taliban continue to gain ground. But the way he is going about formulating a new policy engenders little confidence. The Wall Street Journal previously reported that there is growing support in the White House for a complete pullout of U.S. forces. Moreover, there is concomitant interest in an idea pushed by Blackwater founder Erik Prince to replace U.S. troops with contractors. In a previous article, I pointed out that there is no reason to think that contractors would be any more successful, to put it mildly. Now, NBC News has reported more details of a National Security Council meeting on Afghanistan that, if accurate, should raise a lot of eyebrows. During the July 19 meeting, NBC reported, Trump repeatedly suggested that Defense Secretary James Mattis and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff Gen. Joseph Dunford replace Gen. John Nicholson, the commander of U.S. forces in Afghanistan, because he is not winning the war, the officials said. There are now rumors that Trump might fire Nicholson, replace him with National Security Advisor and LT, Gen. H.R. McMaster, and bring in CIA Director Mike Pompeo to replace McMaster as NSA. The president also allegedly compared the situation in Afghanistan to the renovation in 1987 of his favorite restaurant, the 21 Club in Manhattan. He claimed that an outside consultant had recommended revamping the restaurant's kitchen, lousy advice that cost the owner a year of lost business, and that talking to the restaurant's waiters instead might have yielded a better result. He also said the tendency is to assume if someone isn't a three-star general he doesn't know what he's talking about, and that in his own experience in business talking to low-ranking workers has gotten him better outcomes. What are we to make of these comments, assuming they are accurate? First, General McNicholson is not the problem in Afghanistan. He knows as much about that country as any general officer, having spent 3.5 years there before assuming top command in early 2016, including 16 months as a brigade commander in the dangerous eastern part of the country. Nicholson is universally respected within the military as a smart, highly capable officer. But not even Patton and MacArthur, Trump's favorite generals, could possibly prevail with the paucity of resources available to Nicholson. He commands fewer than 10,000 troops, and most of those are advisors, not in direct combat. This is a result of the overly hasty troop drawdown dictated by President Obama. If Trump wants to blame someone for the deterioration of conditions in the country, it should be his predecessor, not his commander on the ground. In fact, Nicholson has been agitating for reinforcements. Trump would be well advised to grant those additional troops as reportedly recommended by McMaster, rather than firing Nicholson and sending McMaster in his place. McMaster is, to be sure, a highly capable general, one of the very best. He deserves to gain 4 stars in a senior command after his grueling and thankless White House tour. But Trump is fooling himself if he thinks that McMaster can prevail where Nicholson could not if he is not granted more resources. Second, Trump is dreaming if he thinks the U.S. could possibly turn a profit in Afghanistan. Yes, studies indicate that there is $1 trillion of mineral wealth in the ground, but it's not being effectively exploited because of lawless conditions on the ground. The U.S. objective should not be to seize Afghanistan's mineral wealth, and trying to do so would cost far more than it would generate in the foreseeable future. It would also fan violent resentment among Afghans. The Taliban keeps telling the people that the U.S. troops are there to rob them blind. Trump should not confirm this dangerous misconception. The U.S. is there to prevent the country from falling once again under the control of violent jihadists, which would not only threaten the U.S. directly. Afghanistan was, after all, the launching point of 9/11, but could also ripple out across the region and the world. A Taliban takeover could destabilize nuclear-armed Pakistan next door. The catastrophe that would ensue from a Taliban takeover is far more costly than the efforts the U.S. is making today to prevent such an eventuality by bolstering the democratically elected, pro-Western President Ashraf Ghani. A third and final point: Trump clearly doesn't know anything about Afghanistan or warfare. Instead of trying to make lame analogies to what he does know, Manhattan real estate and restaurants, perhaps he should go to Afghanistan, a country that he has never visited. He claims that it's better to listen to ordinary soldiers, the waiters in his 21 Club analogy, than to generals, the high-priced consultants. In truth, a wise president would listen to both. But Trump hasn't spoken to either. Indeed, he has never talked to General Nicholson, whom he now cavalierly talks of firing. It is incumbent on Trump to educate himself before he makes decisions that will have perilous consequences for American security. An alternative to social justice emerges. This week, Republicans are leaning into the culture wars, and Democrats may not be aware of the extent to which the GOP has the upper hand. President Trump has saddled up alongside Senators Tom Cotton and David Perdue to reveal a set of conservative immigration reform proposals dubbed the RAISE Act. The proposal's aim is to reduce legal low-skilled immigration into the country in favor of the high-skilled. The stated objective of this bill would be to increase wages. At least, that's the theory. A real effect of the RAISE Act on American wages is debatable, if only because conservative policy analysts are busily debating them. Moreover, the RAISE Act was actually introduced in February, and the chance that it would actually pass the Senate, much less become law, is dim. It was trotted out this week as a political tool. That does not, however, render it irrelevant. It should be seen as part of a broad and comprehensive push on the part of Republicans to shift the national conversation on divisive socio-political issues in a conservative direction. The administration's push for a legislative remedy to America's immigration system, which is in many ways a lottery-based family reunification program, dovetails with the Department of Justice's alleged effort to address discrimination in the American education system. The New York Times reported on Tuesday that Trump's Justice Department was reshuffling resources in the Civil Rights Division to counter affirmative action admissions guidelines that discriminate against qualified white and Asian college applicants. I say alleged because it took the department almost 24 hours to refute the accuracy of the report. Justice was, in fact, only seeking civil rights attorneys to investigate a single complaint brought by an Asian American alleging racial discrimination, and the Times story implied an overly broad shift in the Civil Rights Division's mandate. Yet, for those 24 hours, the revelation that the Trump Justice Department was at long last going to address the unintended discriminatory consequences of affirmative action programs in universities was greeted warmly by conservatives. The Trump Justice Department's efforts to address discriminatory practices fit with those of the Trump Education Department's. Secretary Betsy DeVos' department recently revealed that it intends to curb the abuse of Title IX sexual assault claims on college campuses. In 2011, the Obama administration issued a memorandum that resulted in reduced standards by which those who have been accused of sexual misconduct on campus can be punished, or even expelled. rather than reasonable doubt, which is the standard by which a conviction is secured in a court of law where false accusations of criminal behavior is a crime. Campus tribunals now determine guilt or innocence based only on the preponderance of evidence available. In other words, just 50.1% certainty is enough to seek an expulsion, an indelible stain that will all but prevent the convicted from ever receiving a degree from an institution of higher learning. According to a study of 262 insurance claims paid to students as a result of sexual assault from 2006 to 2010, 72% went to wrongly accused men who were mistreated by the universities. And that was before Obama's Dear Colleague letter. The common thread that ties all these efforts together is merit. Merit should allow immigrants the privilege of settling in the United States, displacing American workers in the process. Merit, not skin color, should yield to young adults the opportunities associated with attending the college of their choice. Merit should determine the guilt or innocence of someone accused of a crime as heinous as rape. This stands in contrast with the practice of progressive retributive justice that's become commonplace over the last decade. The progressive standard in education, sexual assault accusations, and immigration is not merit but cultural grievance. Democrats responded to the RAISE Act by decrying the Republican effort to limit the world's access to the American dream and to punish immigrant families by deprivileging reunification rights. The abuse of Title IX and affirmative action programs that advantage perceived victim classes, minorities and women, may break a few eggs. In the process, i.e., Asians, whites, legacy applicants, and falsely accused young men. But sacrifices must be made to atone for the sins of long-dead generations. Democrats would do well to take the Republican case up at face value. Donald Trump did run an often explicit campaign of cultural resentment targeting white and male voters. The Trump White House is sending unmistakable signals to the base voters, some of whom undoubtedly harbor unhealthy feelings of antipathy toward racial minorities and women. Democrats have legitimate cases to make against the Trump administration's efforts to correct for the excesses of progressivism. But they must recognize that Republicans have won a mandate. Part of that mandate is to reintroduce objective standards of fairness into the conduct of American affairs, not the pursuit of punitive social justice. COMMENTARY's Abe Greenwald recently identified the criteria by which observers could determine whether a Trump administration policy actually deserves to be called a policy. The proposals revealed the Trump administration revealed weak does not pass the Greenwald test. They are, however, consistent with conservatism's philosophical and cultural divergence with progressivism, and they set the stage for a conflict that could have a broader social impact than any narrow public policy ever could. Democrats will be tempted to object to the Trump administration's efforts on the grounds that they are sexist and racist. Precisely the opposite. Republicans will counter. This is a meritocracy, and Republicans will have made the better case.